Um, we'll be focusing primarily on Parshas Matos. I want to take you straight into an Ibn Ezra, which I think radically transforms the way you learn Parshas Matos right at the beginning of the Parsha. And it is simply to do with the order of this Parsha, right? And I'll show you what I mean. You'll be familiar with the fact that the Parsha, of course, begins with Nedarim, right? Parsha Nedarim, and the rules surrounding that. But the Ibn Ezra says to us the following. The very first Ibn Ezra on the Parsha, you're following, you'll see it inside. Rosh Hamatos says Ibn Ezra, Fi daiti, according to my opinion, Shazos Parsha Hoysa, Acha Milchemes Midyan. This Parsha actually took place after the Battle of Midyan. So in other words, in the Torah, you have the Parsha of Nedarim, and then you have the battle against Midyan, and then you have the episode with the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, who demand the land. They ask for the land on the other side of the Yarden, and Moshe makes the whole deal with them. That's the order we have it in the Torah. Says the Ibn Ezra, actually, this Parsha took place after the battle with Midyan. Al-Kain hi achareho, and therefore it's after it. Come over to David Miriam va'Aaron b'Moshe, achar va'yu b'chatzirus, kasher pirashti. Okay, now he says like this. He says, v'hakosav Omar, the Pasuk says, Shebo b'nei Gad el Moshe ve'el Elazar, that the b'nei Gad came to Moshe and Elazar, that the, as we mentioned, the b'nei Gad, they come to Moshe and to Elazar, ve'el nasi ha'eda, v'dibru divrei. They come and they speak their words and they say, we want to remain on this side of the Yarden. Va'acharei kain, and after that, Kosav, the Pasuk says, va'itzav lohem Moshe es Elazar ha'kohen, ve'es Yoshua binun ve'es Roshi avos hamatos. Okay, it says that he commanded, Moshe Rabbeinu commanded Elazar HaKohen and Yeshua ben Nun and the Roshei Avos Hamatos. That is, let's just find that a second. So if you look after the battle with Midyan, you have the approach of the Bnei Gad and the Bnei Reuven, and they come along and say, he doesn't bring exactly where but he tells them, he gives the instruction to them, and this is the key point then. He says, because the Pasuk says to Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, that which comes out of your mouth you shall do, because there's a whole issue with the there's an issue with the whole with the commitment that they make. We'll come back to that in a moment. He says, listen, you've got to make sure that you come across the Yarden in order to help the rest of Bnei Israel, and only then will I allow you to take your part on the other side of the Yarden. And the words used are, you need to keep your word. We need to be sure that what your commitment is an honest and true one, and you will indeed do what you say and join in the battle, only then go back to the side of the Yarden. Al-Kain, therefore, says Ibn Ezra, the Pasuk says, Vaydaber Moshe el Roshei Hamatos. Therefore, it says, subsequent to that, Moshe spoke to the Roshei Hamatos, the heads of the Shvatim, B'sham Kosav K'chol Yotzim Piv Yaseh. And here it says also, you have to keep your words. So basically, what Ibn Ezra has done here, very, very cleverly, is he's made a connection between, in both cases, as in the case of the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, it refers also to the Roshei Hamatos. It refers to the heads of the Shvatim. Where exactly that posuk is escaping me at the moment. He doesn't bring the makar for it, but it's
towards the end. It's between Shvi and Matos.
Given to the Roshei al Hamatos. So that's the comparison between the Roshei al Hamatos here, the heads of the Shvatim here, and the heads of the Shvatim there. But even more significantly than that, the words are the same. He says to them, "You make sure you keep your promise." Says Ibn Ezra, that's the same as here. Here it says the whole way through. It says, you have to keep your word. And therefore he says the correct sequence in this parsha is actually, Ibn Ezra particularly often says this. There's no particular order, no specific order necessarily in the Torah. She says this parsha actually belongs subsequent to that one. Okay? That after this whole dialogue and this whole thing with the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, who want their peace on the other side of the Yarden, Moshe Rabbeinu, and he comes to a deal with them, and he tells you, you've got to keep your word. Then we introduce Parshas Nedarim. Now, why do I think that's so significant? Because I think it actually changes the whole, if you like, the message and the significance of this Parsha. people wonder, everyone wonders, why is this here? What is this? They seems to stand alone. It doesn't seem, how you keep the word Shavuot and Adar. It could be anywhere. Why is it specifically here? Why is it that it talks about the Roshei Avot, the Roshei Hamatos, the instruction is given to the heads of the Shvatim? All the Meforshim wonder about this. According to Ibn Ezra, it is a parsha that is born out of a very, very difficult episode. Right? An episode where two Shvatim say, actually, we don't really want to enter Eretz Yisrael. We're quite comfortable where we are. And there has to be a whole contract drawn up with them. And you've got to make sure you keep your word and you keep your commitment. And out of that, we learn individual commitment, right? From the commitment that those two Shvatim have to make, we learn all the rules around. And it stems from that, right? The commitment that individuals need to make as well. That, I think, that is why, and therefore, based on the Ibn Ezra, I think we need to learn and understand the parsha of the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven to understand the Nedarim properly. If we follow the orders of Ibn Ezra, do you understand? We need to properly understand what went on with that episode to properly understand the Torah's perspective on commitment. I call this here the concept of commitment, to keep your word, to keep your promises. Learn Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven properly, and you understand their request, and you understand this parsha down. That's what I'm suggesting. Right, that's my suggestion based on Ibn Ezra. So let's go to the parsha of the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. Let's try and understand some key messages from there. So Perek Lamed Beis, Pasuk Aleph to Beis, which is the beginning of the parsha. We have a Ramban. Lamed Beis, the beginning of the Perek. The beginning of the Perek. So the Ramban. So the Ramban says like this. The Ramban notices in the first two psukim that the order is reversed. That's the first thing he points out, right? So it says that they had a lot of flock, the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, these two Shvatim, and they saw the land, etc., etc. They thought it was very nice, and they decided to stay on that side. And then it says Vayovoyu Bnei Gad or Bnei Reuven. And then it says the Bnei Gad and the Bnei Reuven came to Moshe and said, we quite like it here. Please can we keep it? So why is the order changed? Why at the beginning, when it describes the flocks, it puts Reuven before God, and then when they make a request, it says they came Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. That's the first thing the Ramban deals with. Says the Ramban, Hiktim Bnei. He says Techilo Hiktim. Just skipping a few lines. Techilo Hiktim Reuven Shahoya Hagadol. First, it puts Reuven first, as you would expect, because he is the older of the two, and he was the eldest of all the Shvatim. Va'achar kach Hiktim Gad. And then it puts God, Shahayu, Hagiburim, Harugem, Nikorim. It brings the pasuk in Devarim, the Torah, Zeroya, Afkot Code, the pasuk of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe gives the bracha to God. They seem to have been particularly fierce in battle. Okay, and so that's why when it talks about the first time it talks about the flock, it says Reuven before God, because the significance precedence is given to the older of the two. But when it comes to the next part, sorry, I was just in the bottom. Sorry, I was just reading the bottom. I think he brings in the same point. But the Ramban says he was the Bechar. Right. He says that although we start off with the Bnei Reuven, the rest of the parsha, God comes first. They gave this advice. They were really the driving force. God was, not Reuven. They spoke to Moshe first about this inheritance. They were stronger. They were mightier warriors than Reuven. That's why they were unafraid to live alone in this land. They weren't afraid. They had no problem with it. No problem being alone because they were mighty warriors. Now, he comes to what was Moshe Rabbeinu's real concern? Moshe was concerned Moshe Rabbeinu was worried that beneath their requests, actually, despite all them being mighty warriors, was actually a fear, the same fear as the Meraglim, right? The same fear as the spies. So they were worried that really
in Canaan they would just be too strong and they'd never overcome them. You'll never be able to conquer them. And that he was worried that was underlying their request to not even go into Eretz Yisrael. There was a remnant, a residue of what had transpired with the Meraglim. And that's why he said to them, that they were not trusting in Hashem just like their ancestors didn't. And he says that they're going to have the same problem to remain in the desert. And that's why they answered him. They said, no, that's not the reason at all. We're not afraid. We have no problem. We're not afraid. We're going to enter. On the contrary, we're going to go first into Eretz Canaan. We are going to lead the battle. We're not worried at all. Understand these words of the Ramban. She'enam, his concern was, and if you read the Psukim, you see that Moshe is really, really upset by the request. It really, really disturbs him. He uses the words, they're going to wage battle. You're going to stay here. You're destroying everything. You're going to stop all of them going into Eretz, and they're all going to follow your example. It's going to be terrible. And then he goes back to the story of the Meraglim, okay? How they all became afraid and they were terrified, and only Kalev and Yeshua were able to end. And he goes through the whole story again. The Ramban says his primary concern was the lack of commitment. That was what he was worried about. The same idea, I think, right? That their trust in Hashem was weak. They didn't have that level of bitachon. They were falling into the same trap of the Meraglim. They didn't have the self-assurance that they needed to stay, to stay the task, to make sure they fulfilled and went in the right direction and actually were able to enter and conquer Eretz Yisrael. That was his concern. And that was why there was such a severe response. Because if there was a fault in their commitment in the first place, if the fault was the same fault as the Meraglim, that idea of not fully trusting in Hashem, that would lead everything else to unravel. If it was weak, it was almost like the foundations would be weak. That's what I think the Ramban means when he says that Moshe Rabbeinu is so concerned and so disturbed by the request because of the lack of bitachon. So you'll ask me, okay, fine, right? We know bitachon is really important. We have to trust in Hashem. Why was it that this was so significant for them in particular? And the answer is because if you go first, you have to set an example for everyone who comes after you. You have no choice. If you're going to make that decision to go first in anything in life, you have to realize that people will learn from you, whether you like it or not, for good or for bad. People are going to learn either way from you, right? And that's why the decisions that are made here are so significant. They're so sensitive. Even the words they use are sensitive, right? Look at Rashi, the famous Rashi, Perek Lamed Beis, Pasuk Zion. Rashi says, highlights the reversal of the order in their request, right? Nivne lemiknenu koi, they say we're going to build pens for our livestock here, right, where we are on the other side of the Yarden, on the east bank. Cities for our young. Says Mashi, they were more worried about their property than their family, than their children. They put their livestock before they're young. Well, that's interesting because hold that thought for a second. Not significantly, you're absolutely right. Moshe said to him, that's wrong. Make the primary and the secondary. First build cities for your families, and then build pens for your sheep. Now, let me ask you a very simple, basic question. That's why you reverse the order. You've got to make sure you've got to do it in the right order. First, you've got to cities and livestock. Let me ask you an obvious question, right? Were they seriously going to leave their families, right, in the fields, right, whilst they set up pens for the animals, the cattle, and the sheep? I mean, it's basic humanity. People don't do that to their kids. Are you with me? So it's a basic question on the whole, on what Rashi's saying. Was it really the case that that's what they intended to do? And therefore there must be something else here going on. I don't know if that links to your point, but about whether Yaakov, I don't think it's clear that Yaakov did it in that order, does it? But Yeah, but whether that I know that order is specifically highlighted here. Here Chazal notice it because of the reversal of the order when Moshe Rabbeinu tells them what to do. So the Kliyakar says, again, if you're following this at the beginning, Apostle Aleph, the Kliyakar says like this. Of course, there was a limud zchus, he says. It wasn't. There was a worthy reason for what they were trying to do. Right? What was their idea? He says he brings basically that there are certain types of animals which actually can work as protection. He brings the Gemara in Tanis that there was a story of Izim, which were Horeg Ze'evim. There were goats which were even able to kill wolves. There are some forms of livestock that can actually be pretty nasty. And therefore, he says, that was really what they had in mind. Yeah, they said, we're living near the border. So we better set up pens for our livestock first. And then kind of further inland, they'll be on the outskirts. And further inland, that's where we'll build the cities for our families, for our children. And effectively, what will happen is, he says, Shataf Yeshua B'tuchim, is the second paragraph in the Kliyakar, and the first posuk in the paragraph. Shataf Yeshua B'tuchim. The children will be secure. She'im Yavoyu Ha'izim, if enemies come, Yavoyu Tchila Al Gidra Soin, Beini Beini, they'll come first to attack the animals, basically, and the children inside will be saved as a result. Okay? And that was their justification. So therefore, you're going to ask me, what's the problem? Sounds like a great plan. Simple, yeah. Great, it's a great idea. So why was Moshe Rabbeinu upset? Says the Kliyakar. Moshe said to him, Cain, you're not entirely secure. You are not secure that Hashem will save you. You are so worried that you have to build it in that way. You don't have that trust in Hashem. This is what you should do. First, build the cities, right? Even if it's close to the border, and you should build your pens for your livestock further inland. Don't worry. Everyone else will see. Everyone else will see that you are secure, that you trust in the salvation of Hashem. Through that, you will give omet, you will give strength to everyone else, in the heart of everyone else, because they will see that you trust in Hashem. The Kliyakar is, again, I think, re-emphasizing this point of the Ramban. In normal circumstances, it would be a very valid reason, justification. Let's be sensible. Let's be secure. Let's make sure that we have we can put the children on the inside, and if there's enemies or whatever. But you don't have that luxury. He was saying to them, you have decided to be the nachshon. You're the one. You're going to be the first to set up camp, to establish cities. You are setting the example for everyone else because you've decided that you want to settle here, and therefore you need to make sure that every single thing you do shows absolute 100% commitment, that there is tidnu ometz b'lei v'chechem. You put strength in the heart of everyone else. He brings later on a posuk in Mishnah. The posuk in Mishnah says, "Nachlom of a heles porishona," inheritance confuses in the outset, v'acharisa lo tzavorach, and then the result is not being blessed. He says the posuk means, he brings a chazal, he brings a tanchuma, which says, because they took their inheritance first, there was a real concern, effectively, that there wouldn't be, the result was, unfortunately, sadly, that their end was not blessed, because they were the ones who were the first to be exiled. If you look in Sefer Malachim, the first to be taken into exile by Sancheriv was actually Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, and they went first. And the idea is, Nachalom of Aheles Borashona, he says, because they put their inheritance first. That means to say, they wanted to establish places for their livestock first incorrectly. They didn't want to set that example. Therefore, their end, their youngsters, the people who came after them, the tough, that's how he's understanding it, right? The tough, the next generation, the children, their descendants, unfortunately, sadly, weren't blessed because they should have done things in the right way. They should have set that example. So the point here, I think, is that we learn from the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven that when the notion of what it means to make a commitment and the particular responsibility we have in terms of those who make a commitment first, in terms of the influence they have on others. How does that relate back to the Parsha of Nedarim? Because that helps us understand how it begins. As I said, all the Mefarshim ask, Why does it say Vaydaber Moshe Rosh Hamatos? If you turn back to the beginning, Lamed Posuk base, Vaydaber Moshe Rosh Hamatos Livnei Yisrael Leimar. Hashem says to the Rosh Hamatos, the heads of all the Shvatim. What is the reason why it specifically talks about the Rosh Hamatos? And the Mefarshim give different explanations here. Rashi says it's because to give honor to the Nesiim first, and then to the rest of the Bnei Yisrael. So the heads of the Shvatim should be given that honor first. Says the Ramban that there was a specific responsibility here on the leaders, on the Rosh Hamatos. He says that really when it comes to the rules around, a lot of the rules that are around, for example, the annulment of vows, it rests on knowing the details of these halachos and the people who would have to carry them out, right? If there is a chacham who's matir and neder to annul a vow, has to know what to do, has to know the details of these rules. He says that the medrash and the Dorim, that's why it's spelled out specifically to them. And he says furthermore, the medrash, and he brings the Gemara in the Dorim, which says, "Ki l'rosh hamatos," this is the Ramban, "Yod v'shem ben Dorim yosim eshar ha'om." They have more of a hand, a name, and influence when it comes to Nedorim than the rest of the people. He means it in a practical sense, in the sense that they have to know the laws, they have to know the rules, they have to know these halachas, even more so than perhaps other areas, because it depends on them. Sometimes the only way to get out, usually the only way to get out potentially of a neder is actually through going to a chacham, to a leader, to someone who has responsibility, right? But I think on a deeper level, we can also understand that the reason why it says Rosh Hamatos, it talks about the heads of the Shvatim, parallels and links, as that Ibn Ezra says, to the example that the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven was supposed to set. Hashem is saying like this to the heads of the Shvatim. When it comes to demonstrating commitment, when it comes to showing that a word is a word, that your word means a word, the responsibility inevitably devolves on leaders to a greater extent than everyone else. It doesn't mean that there is a less of a responsibility on the Hamoed Am, on the general populace to keep their word. Of course there is. The same. The level of responsibility, we all have the same. You have to keep Nedorim and Shuras, you have to keep your oaths and vows, everyone has to keep their word. But the difference is that when a leader doesn't keep their word, what happens is it undermines the system for everyone else, right? Just as the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven are treated so strictly, if there's a tiny crack in their lack of trust in Hashem, it will unravel everything else for the rest of Klal Yisrael. You are deciding to go first. You've put yourself in a position of leadership. You have said that you want to cross, you want to settle here, and you will be in charge and you will lead the others into battle. So you need to understand that if there's anything which weakens that omet, that strength in the heart of everyone else, that's a problem. The responsibility, you cannot, it's a fundamental lesson of the whole Torah. That leadership comes with achrayus, it comes with responsibility. That's what it means to be a leader. To be a leader is to accept responsibility. That's the primary aspect of leadership in the Torah. That's what it is. And that's demonstrated both by the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, and also by the fact that this parsha of keeping your word begins specifically with the Rosh Hamatos. And there's one final idea here, and that is on the words Kechol hayotzim mipiv yaseh. So that the end of Pasuk Gimel at the beginning of the parsha, the Torah says Kechol hayotzim mipiv yaseh. You have to do according to every aspect of your word. The Dubna Maggid says, why does it use this word Kechol? Like everything. So the simple explanation is obviously, Kol hayotzim mipiv yaseh. It should do. It's what it should say. It would seem. You should do everything that you promised to do. What's kechol, like everything? The Dubna Maggid says, kechol shenira midvorov roi lo shekaiman. According to how it seems, the realistic meaning of your words, that's what you should do. Yeah, as it seems your words mean. In other words, it's so easy when it comes to a word, giving one's word, right? To find a sort of way to twist out of it. Says the Dubna Maggid, like your words actually mean. That's the emphasis. That's what you should mean. And the Sefer Tam B'das Ala Torah, Moshe Sternbuch, he says, he brings that actually we learn from the Parsha of Nedarim, our entire approach, not just to how we're supposed to keep our word, but also about our attitude towards mitzvahs in general, towards doing mitzvahs in general. He says like this, he brings the, there's a Gemara in Nedarim, which says, how do you know you can make a shvua to reinforce the fact that you're going to do a mitzvah? The Pasuk says, Nishpati v'akayema l'shmor mishpatei tzikecha. Because I made an oath, the Pasuk in Tehillim, because you test, Nishpati v'akayema. Anyone who went to Hasmo knows these words off by heart. Nishpati v'akayema, right? Nela ugly, yeah, right? Nishpati v'akayema. I made an oath and I will fulfill it. L'shmor mishpatei tzikecha, to guard the justice or the mishpat tzikecha of your righteousness. And the Gemara asks that there's a basic problem with this. Because mitzvahs, the Torah tells us to keep. So what are you adding to it? Right? What exactly are you adding to the mitzvahs when you say a shavua that you're going to do a mitzvah? Right? Nishpati v'akayema. What does it mean? Right? The Gemara answers, Kamash malon deshoyin leinish leziruzei nafshe. A person is allowed to give themselves a boost in life. You're allowed to. Generally speaking, we avoid Nedarim and Shvuos. Even this area, it's a complicated area to know how to practically, in terms of practical halacha. But the way the Gemara says it is you're allowed to do something to give yourself a boost in life. Lezareis nafshe, leziruzei nafshe, to push yourself forward. And then there's a machlokes rishonim exactly whether or not it has a practical impact in halacha. The Ramban says that effectively that it doesn't make him specifically, you can't make really a shvua on a dvar mitzvah, something you're already commanded to do. It doesn't have the impact of an enforceable shvua in that way. In other words, you won't transgress ba'al yachel devoro, not to the negative issa, the love in this week's parsha. You wouldn't according to the Ramban, you wouldn't break that through not keeping this particular shvua. So Ramesh Shlomo says, so what exactly are you doing? What is the impact? So he says that the pasuk which says Kol hayotzim mipiv yaseh, you should do everything that has come out of your mouth. It means like this is exactly what it's coming to include. Since David HaMelech says Nishpati v'akayema, I make an oath and I will keep it. But a person spurs himself on to do the right thing. It is inevitably included in that phrase, Kol hayotzim mipiv yaseh. Everything your mouth utters, that's what you should do. And that, when a person takes the step of giving themselves this boost and making this shavua, this oath to keep a mitzvah, what they're really doing is they are taking that mitzvah and entering it into the category of make sure you keep your word. That's what you're doing. You're including it into the word, into the phrase, Kol hayotzim mipiv yaseh. Everything that you say, you should do. And that's what we learn from here, I think, is the idea that Nedarim and the idea of keeping our words is not just about keeping your word, which of course is fundamentally important in and of itself. It also teaches us that the commitment we should have in general towards mitzvahs in general, not just to our word, is on that level of Nedarim. That we should. That's what I think the Gemara is learning out almost of this idea of making a shvur, this idea of making an oath to keep a mitzvah, which you have to do anyway. The answer is you can give yourself a boost in the way you do mitzvahs so that you look at them as if it is, even if you don't make the actual shvur, right? As if it's k'chol hayotzim mipiv yaseh. Just as we instinctively know, I've given my word. That's how we should look at mitzvahs. That we've given our word. We've given our word to Hashem. We've given our word to exactly Nasa v'Nishma. We have given our word. We've given our word. We've given our commitment to do the mitzvahs. So therefore, what you learn from Parsha, just to look at the whole thing as a whole, we started with Ibn Ezra. You move from this Parsha, learn this Parsha in the reverse. Start with Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, understand the demand that Hashem made from them, and Moshe Rabbeinu made from them. You need to keep your word. You need to set an example. You need to show a commitment that's 100% because you're in a leadership role. We learn from there to the emphasis on the Rosh Matos, and in turn, the heads of the Shvatim about keeping a word with Shavuos and Nedarim. From there, we learn that implies that's the same for everyone else. And also, it doesn't only apply to Nedarim and Shvuos, but in fact it applies to every aspect of how we keep the Torah and mitzvahs. So, have a good evening. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you. Guten Abend.
What was that?